Good morning. Please take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew 7 verses 13 through 29 is where we're going to be today. We're going to look at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The reason why the close of Jesus' greatest sermon matters to us today is because we are living in a time here in the modern West where there is a great falling away from Jesus and from the church. In Generation Z, the younger generation, there are rising rates of atheism and agnosticism. In my generation of the millennials, it's become very popular to do this thing called deconstruction, where you take apart the Christian faith that you were raised with, and often it leads to completely walking away, deconverting, as it's called. But don't just think I'm only speaking to younger people here today. If you're a veteran follower of Christ today, you've actually seen more in your lifetime to cause you cynicism and skepticism, not less than a younger follower of Christ. And you have things in you, I have things in me, everyone here today has things inside of your heart that if left to themselves would seek to pull you away from Jesus. If I had to put the close of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, into a one-sentence summary, it would be this. Jesus is not looking for fickle admirers, but rather Jesus is calling individuals to follow him with endurance. He's not interested in fickle admirers of him, but he is calling individuals to follow him with endurance. You don't just want to start well with Jesus. I don't want to just start well and have a good run for a few years with Jesus. We want to finish well. That's my great longing for our young people here at our church, for my kids, that decades from now, they and we would be able to look back and say, I'm so glad that I stayed with Jesus. And I'm a big believer in the keeping power of God to preserve his people, and that he empowers us to persevere with him. But he does it through means that he gives us. And that is exactly what Jesus is addressing here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. He is addressing what are the means of how we follow him with endurance. So with that said, let's read together the end of Matthew 7, starting in verse 13 down to the end of the chapter, Matthew 7, 13 through 29. Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, you will recognize them by their fruits. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.' Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. This is a difficult passage, and I actually preach it with some fear and trembling, because my fear is this, that as we walk through this difficult passage together, that you will be tempted to just be crushed under the weight of it. But let me say this at the beginning. Hold on. Hold on to the difficulty of walking through this passage, and I think you will see hope at the end. And so Jesus is going to give 3 actions here in our passage for what it looks like to follow him with endurance. So as Jesus calls you to follow him with endurance, he tells you first, expect pressure on your journey. Expect pressure on your journey. This is the first part, verses 13 and 14. And Jesus is going to use this metaphor of a journey or a road. He says, following in his teaching is like following on a way. And that doesn't start with Jesus. It's not original to him. This is actually language that is used all throughout the Old Testament, where following God is described as walking along a way or a path or a journey or a road. For example, in Jeremiah 6, it says, God says, look for the ancient ways. Ask where the ancient ways are and walk on those. Jesus is using that language. It's almost like if you've seen the television show on Disney Plus of the Mandalorian, where the common refrain of the Mandalorians is one will say to the other, this is the way. And then the others will repeat back to the speaker, this is the way. Well, that's basically what Jesus is doing here. As he's wrapping up his sermon, he's saying, if you want to truly follow me and live in my kingdom that I am establishing, this is the way. But notice that Jesus loves us here. He loves us enough to not sugarcoat what it will look like to follow him. He makes no illusions about how this is going to be an easy path to follow him. He tells us what to expect on this road that he's calling us to walk. And first he says this is going to be a hard and narrow way. The word that is used here is also used in the Gospel of Mark, in Mark 3, when it describes a crowd that is crushing in on Jesus. It's the idea of pressure that was used sometimes to describe what you did with grapes when you pressed down on them to make wine. It's the word that Paul uses throughout his letters to describe opposition coming against the apostles and the followers of Jesus. It's a word that means that following Jesus will be pressure-filled. It will be hard. The way will be hard. But second, Jesus says that those who walk on this way will be in the minority. He says those who find it, who walk on it, will be few. Meaning, you're not going to be in the dominating position of society, the dominating place of culture as you follow Jesus. You're not going to be in the majority, you're going to be in the minority. What Jesus is describing here is basically the exile life. That following him is almost like living in exile. What does a person in exile experience? Well, they know that they're living in a place that is not their home. They know that they don't hold a place of power. They know they don't live among those who are the majority culture in their society. They know that they are actually going against the culture in the place where they're living. And walking in this way that Jesus is describing in the Sermon on the Mount, he's saying it's not going to be easy and you're not going to be in the majority. Do you expect following Jesus to be hard? And do you expect that it will put you in the minority, that it will be pressure-filled to walk this way? Or are you surprised when you encounter opposition as you walk with Jesus, walk after Jesus? I'm worried that part of the problem of why we see so many young people walking away from the church and from Jesus is they didn't really understand what it meant to count the cost of following Jesus. And when they encounter opposition and pressure, when they discover that the way is hard, and follow Jesus, they realize, oh, I didn't sign up for this. And they walk away. I really don't want that to be the case for the young people here at our church. So I will frequently tell them, if you want to follow Jesus for real, you have got to get used to the fact, even now, that you're not going to be in the majority. You're going to be seen as the odd one, as the outsider, as the strange one in following Jesus. You have to get used to that now. But you can tell that you actually are expecting pressure as you walk this way of Jesus by how you respond, how you react to opposition. Are you shocked and offended when you hear of Christians being opposed for their faith in our country? Or when you encounter opposition or mocking for your faith? Does that anger you? Does that shock you? Does that discourage you? When you realize that you are the only follower of Christ on your college campus, or your high school campus, or at your job? Or is your attitude more of, this is what Jesus told us to expect. Jesus prepared us for this. He told us to expect pressure on our journey. So expect pressure on your journey. But two, as Jesus calls you to follow him with endurance, he tells you to stay alert to dangerous voices. Stay alert to dangerous voices. This is the next section of Matthew 7, verses 15 through 23. I think all this section holds together nicely. But the idea is this: as you walk this hard, pressure-filled way, you're going to encounter voices along the way that are going to tell you what you should be doing as you're walking on this way. And the voices that you listen to and allow into your life are going to shape how you walk and how you live. But not all of these voices are going to be sent by God and be helpful to you. And Jesus warns of what he calls false prophets. Literally, the word there in the Greek is pseudo-prophetess. Fake prophet, pseudo-prophet. And Jesus says, beware of them, or watch out for them. He describes them in this very graphic picture of coming to you dressed outwardly in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. So the point here is that what they look like on the outside does not match who they are on the inside. Inside, they are very dangerous and deadly to you. Watch out for them. Beware of them. But what's fascinating to me is Jesus says that you'll recognize them by their fruit. But then Jesus starts describing several outward actions that to us in reading, or to the listeners hearing this sermon, would probably think, oh, that looks like good fruit to me. Jesus says things like doing miracles, casting out demons, giving prophecies. And we would be tempted to think, oh, that must be good fruit. Maybe this person is a trustworthy and reliable voice in my life. But Jesus is saying, no, these are not distinguishing marks of what good fruit is. In fact, in Matthew 24, later in this gospel, Jesus is going to again warn of false prophets who will perform great signs and wonders. And he says, deceive many and lead many astray. So this is not the kind of fruit that Jesus is talking about, doing these great outward actions of power. So what is the fruit? What is the fruit that distinguishes these voices that we need to look out for? Well, in the greater context of this sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, it's the character that Jesus has been describing throughout this entire sermon. Things like the Beatitudes, where he says, blessed are you, and then the character trait that follows. When Jesus says, you have heard it said, but I say to you, all of those things. It's the seeking the kingdom of God. It's living the life of prayer described in the Lord's Prayer. It's living the non-anxious life. These are the fruit of your life that indicate that you are truly known by Jesus, that you are a trustworthy voice. And the thing about fruit is it does take some time for it to be recognized. In our backyard at home, we have an apple tree, and this tree will go for great periods of time throughout the year. Actually, sometimes it will go an entire year where it doesn't produce fruit. And if you looked at it in that season, you would not even know what kind of an apple, what kind of a tree it was. But eventually, the fruit does reveal itself. And eventually, the fruit of a person's life does reveal itself. But not only do we test the voices by their character, but also by the teaching. Later in Matthew, Jesus is going to again use this analogy of fruit, but he's using it to describe the words that are coming out of their mouth, meaning the teaching. That the words and the teaching of these people will reveal what is inside their heart. The words are the fruit, and the heart is the root. And so, in the immediate context of this sermon, it's fascinating to me that immediately after Jesus says that the way will be hard, it will be pressure-filled, it will be in the minority as you walk in this way of Jesus, that it's right after that he brings up the topic of false prophets. Why? Well, I think the point is this. False prophets are going to try to convince you through their words, their compelling words, maybe even through their outward demonstrations of power, that the way of following Jesus doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be difficult and pressure-filled. You don't have to walk with the minority to walk on this way. And I think that that's supported by the word that Jesus uses to describe them. I've already mentioned that he uses this word, or at least Matthew records this word in the Greek pseudo-prophetess. Well, the interesting thing about this word is that it appears 10 times in the Old Testament, the Greek version of the Old Testament. And the vast majority of those times, 9 out of 10 times when this word appears, it appears in the book of Jeremiah. Which is interesting because a major topic in Jeremiah is this theme of exile. People of God living in exile. One of the marks of false prophets in Jeremiah is that false prophets, pseudo-prophets, they hate the idea of exile. And why would they like exile? No one likes to be in exile because it's hard, it's difficult to live in the minority, to not be in the place of comfort and cultural dominance. And the pseudo-prophets will often say in exile, in Jeremiah, they'll say things like, you're not going to go into exile. That's not your destiny. That's not what your experience is going to be. But of course they do. The people of Israel do go and live in exile. But after that happens, what do the pseudo-prophets say then? Well, they say, well, don't worry, this is going to be really short. Your experience is going to be really short, and then you'll go back to living in a place of prosperity and ease and comfort. And in contrast to these pseudo-prophet voices, the true prophet Jeremiah says, no. Exile is going to be long, and it's going to be hard, and you need to buckle up and settle in for the long road. Jesus likely has this idea in mind, because he warns of false prophets right after talking about the way being hard. And so the point that Jesus is making is this. False prophets are going to try to convince you that the way does not have to be hard, doesn't have to be difficult. You don't have to be in the minority to follow Jesus. And they're going to try to convince you to take an easier path. So in our day and age, what might those voices look like in our culture? Here's just a couple of examples. You could probably fill in several of your own, but here's a couple of examples of what these voices, these dangerous voices, might look like today. They might say, your life as a follower of Christ doesn't have to be hard. You should be healthy and wealthy all the time. Your life should be just full of prosperity. We know this to be the perspective of the health and wealth so-called gospel, prosperity gospel, which is a false and different gospel. Or these dangerous voices might sound something like this. Don't follow outdated Christian sexual ethics. You should be able to do whatever you want to do with your body sexually. You do you. Express yourself however you want to be. This is the modern sexual ethics that tells you that you should define your own gender and sexuality and not let someone else define that for you. Or a voice might sound just simply like this. If part of your life feels too difficult to surrender to Jesus, just keep that part of your life to yourself. So what voices are you giving room to in your life? As you take in voices through media and podcasts and just people that you're around, are these voices shaping your character to look more like the character of the Sermon on the Mount? Or like something else? Stay alert to dangerous voices. So number one, expect pressure on your journey. Number two, stay alert to dangerous voices. Number three, as Jesus calls you to follow him with endurance, he tells you prepare for storms by practicing obedience to him. We prepare for storms by practicing obedience to Jesus. This is the next section, the end of the chapter, verses 24 through 29. Now, oftentimes people will say, this analogy, this very common analogy that we've heard many times of building your house on the rock. And they'll say, well, to build your house on the rock, it means build your life on Jesus. I remember when I was a kid, I had a children's book that said that basically. It talked about the wise man building his house on the rock, and that meant to build your life on Jesus. Well, that's not untrue, but that's not exactly what Jesus is saying. He's actually being more precise, more exact than that. Jesus defines building your house on the rock as obedience to his word. It's the one who hears his words, takes them in, internalizes them, but then does them, acts them out. Just like a few verses earlier when Jesus said it's the one who does the words of his Father in heaven. So building your life on the rock is not just giving lip service to Jesus, saying, oh yes, he's Lord of my life, but it's actually acting as if he's Lord by actually obeying his words. There are several principles that I think emerge from this little word picture that Jesus gives of building your house on the rock or on the sand. Here they are just briefly. One is this: storms are inevitable. Now, different commentators have thought about this a little bit differently. Some say that storms refer to just the trials, the everyday storms of your life. Others say this is probably pointing specifically to the ultimate storm of the final judgment day. Regardless, everyone's going to have to face these storms. Storms will come in your life. Storms are inevitable. Number two, though, everyone is building a house. Notice that Jesus says that the wise man builds a house, the foolish man builds a house. Everyone's building a house, and basically your house means what are the principles that you're building your life on? What are the character traits that you're practicing in your life? Everyone's building a house, both those who are wise and those who are foolish. And the point of storms is they reveal the foundation of the house. What may have looked like a good foundation for a period gets revealed in a storm for what it really is. The next principle is we prepare before the storm, not during the storm. Those of you who've witnessed the damage, the pictures of when storms have come through an area, you see the amazing effects, the powerful effects they can have on a house and on a community. And if people wait until the storm is right upon them to think, oh, I probably should do something to get ready for this storm, well, sadly and tragically, at that point, it's too late. What do meteorologists often say when they're broadcasting about a storm of tornadoes that is approaching a community? They'll say, you should already have your plan in place. You need to go now and get to your safe place. You don't wait till the storm is on you to do that. You prepare before the storm hits, not during. And then lastly, we prepare how? By practicing obedience to Jesus' words. Like I've already said, this is the one who hears the words of Jesus and does them. Now, you may be thinking here as you're listening to this, Is Jesus advocating legalism? Is Jesus teaching that we have to earn our way into the kingdom of heaven, that we come to the Father by earning our acceptance and our merit before Him? No, Jesus is not teaching that here. What Jesus is teaching is a principle that is consistently taught all throughout the New Testament, and it's this: what you really believe is going to be revealed by what you do. What you really believe is going to be revealed eventually by how you live your life. John agrees with this when he says in 1 John 1:6 that the one who says he follows Jesus and loves Jesus and believes Jesus, but doesn't have fellowship with him and walks in darkness, is a liar. And the truth is not in him. James will agree with this when he says in James 2 that faith without works is dead. It's not real faith. And the house that you're building, or the character that you're practicing, ultimately what it's doing is it's revealing what you are doing with the authority of Jesus. See, this passage ends in verses 28 and 29 with the theme of the authority of Jesus. The crowds note that Jesus is teaching as one with authority. And so you can reject the authority of Jesus and build your house, practice character that is built on sand. Or you can recognize the authority of Jesus, the kingship of Jesus, and obey His words by building your house on the rock. So the question for you today is, what kind of house are you building? What kind of house are you building? So we've seen, as we've walked through the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, that following Jesus with endurance means expecting pressure as you follow Him, expecting the way to be hard and to walk in the minority, expect the exile life of pressure. Stay alert to dangerous voices and prepare for storms that are inevitable. Prepare for them by practicing obedience to Jesus. Now here's the key. Here's the key to following Jesus and staying with Him on the hard and narrow way. When you are convinced that what you gain by following Him is more than what you lose, you will be willing to pay the cost and to stay with Him. When you're convinced that what you gain is more than what you lose, you will be willing to walk this hard and narrow way, to pay the cost. This fall marked the 11-year anniversary of my first date with my beautiful wife. Each of us were living in Texas at the time, kind of southwest of Fort Worth, Texas. She was a teacher, teaching Bible at a Christian school, and it was a boarding school, and I was a house parent, a resident parent, living and working with high school guys, and we had been friends for a while, but I had developed a crush on her, and finally got up enough courage to ask her out one day, and surprisingly, I wasn't sure what to expect, but she said yes. And at the time, I learned that the Lion King Broadway musical was playing in Dallas.